Ja, hallo und herzlich willkommen zu dieser Veranstaltung, der New Tech Worker Movement. Der Livestream ist schon gestartet, aber wir fangen hier erst in 10 Minuten an. Aber nicht, dass ihr euch wundert im Livestream, es geht in 10 Minuten los und ihr im Publikum, also hier sammeln sich ja noch alle, keine lauten, peinlichen Dinge sagen, weil das ist jetzt live. Bis gleich. welcome to this event. A new specter is haunting Silicon Valley, and it's not Elon Musk, something else, but we're going to talk about it. The new tech worker movement. Thank you all for coming. This event is in English, as you can hear now. But if questions come up later, then or you can also ask in German, and we can try to translate. If you need translation, tell us. We might be able to come up with whispering, but this will be in English, and there will be a live stream going on right now through this camera. And also you guys on live stream, you are welcome to ask questions. Just write them down, and I'm gonna be able to ask them later on. And if anything is wrong on the live stream, just let us know. So yes, welcome to our guests, Moira Weigel and Ben Tarnoff. I'm glad that you could make it all the way from New York to Berlin. It's a pleasure to have you, and also that you brought your huge suitcase full of Logic magazines, because you're the co-founders, you two, right? Yeah. Logic magazine. And Moira's gonna tell us something about the magazine in a minute, but I have to make like a few organizational remarks before that. So first of all, a little introduction of the two of them. They're not just co-founders of this magazine that we're showing here. That is about tech, as you can probably imagine. But also, Moira is working on an interesting topic. She just published a book in German. It's called Dating, eine Kulturgeschichte. So you have the book with you, right? So people can... someone had it. Okay. Okay. So, looks interesting. And you got an event coming up. So if you're interested in monogamy, I mean, aren't we all? You might you might want to go there. It's called Monogamy for Better or Worse next Tuesday. So just look it up on the internet, and you can hear Moira talk about dating. Interesting topic. Look it up. And then Ben, welcome you too. You're a columnist for Guardian, so people can look up your articles in Guardian, but also you write for Jacobin, for example, which is also why we as Ada Magazine translated a few pieces of yours and interviews that you did with tech workers. That's why I actually got to know you, in a sense that I translated your interview on workers at Google who prevented Pentagon from doing mean stuff. But you can talk about this later on as well. And that's the two of you. And the cooperation now this evening is a little specific. We have never done this before. This is the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, Ada Magazine, and Halb 10 podcast, Half 10. We're doing this podcast like a show once a week for like new left politics. And this is also where the live stream is now going. So you can look it up, halb10.fm, and find different interviews with left politicians, and Steve and I talking about socialist visions. It's worth a look and or listen rather. And Steve couldn't be here tonight, so hello Steve. Sorry you couldn't make it. Last thing, there is a list going on around. The Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung needs your names and signature that you were here, because then the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung can pay for it or something. So thank you in advance for signing up. And the last remark I'm going to make is that we have another event with you two next Saturday, also in Kreuzberg. You can give the address, Ilka, right? Like, we're going to put up the address for the next event. What is it? Your Kiezladen? You weren't listening. Okay. So Ilka's going to be the host on Saturday. Thank you for taking care of the technical stuff here. So the next Saturday event is going to be about the post-American webs and trade war between China and the US. So we're going to zoom out a little and talk about geopolitics and interesting stuff. So you're welcome for all of that. Now, to the topic. Moira's going to talk about the magazine and introduce to you, what was the idea behind it, why you're doing it, and what do the articles look like. And then Ben is going to talk about different tech worker mobilizations in the US. And then later on, we're going to do a little Q&A, like I've prepared some questions about, like, how could socialist or democratic Silicon Valley look like. And then you're welcome to have questions. I'm going to look at questions from the live stream, and yeah, that will be it. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Is this working in the back? Yes. Thank you so much for that introduction, Ines. And we want to thank everyone who is involved in planning this. Ole Rauch, Patrick Starry, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. We're so happy to be here, and we should especially thank you all for being here on this warm evening. We both love Berlin and have spent time here a fair bit of time ago, 2006, 2007. It's interesting, many things have changed. Many things still feel the same, but it's been especially interesting to see Berlin as more of a tech city now than it was when we spent time here before, and especially exciting to talk about tech resistance am Kotti in Kreuzberg, I think. Before, like Ines said, I thought I would just say a few words about the magazine and how and why we started it, and what that has to do with the topic we're mostly talking about tonight, which is tech worker organizing and politics. We got the idea for the magazine, I feel it grew out of a series of conversations we were having with friends in San Francisco, which is where we lived at the time, in 2016. And we put up our website and our sort of manifesto almost exactly a month, I think, before Donald Trump was elected, so October 2016. And at the time, one of the big reasons we wanted to start such a magazine is, there are a few reasons, but one of the important ones was that we felt that the dominant media discourse in the United States around technology very rarely heard from, actually, rank and file people who worked in the tech industry, relatively rarely heard from the people who spent their days building digital technologies. We felt that, a person could have been forgiven for thinking that all of Silicon Valley was just Elon Musk and Sheryl Sandberg and Peter Thiel and, the 5 bosses that got quoted all the time. And so that was part of our thinking behind wanting to start Logic, was to bring the voices of people who work with technology into a space with artists and activists, academics and journalists, other kinds of thinkers who write about it at length, and to treat tech, we often used to say, not just as a business story, which is how we usually felt it was being covered at the time, but as an everything story. So this was all swirling around in our minds, and then the Trump election happened, which was not maybe not a total surprise, but was, I think, very, it shook people up a lot, and it definitely inspired kind of a wave of a new kind of activism that I think Ben will talk about from people in the industry. And it was our serendipity or good fortune, the way things happened, that our magazine sort of came out and grew alongside this growing wave of activism. All of the founders but me, I guess one person now has left, but originally everyone but me at Logic worked at a tech company, was actually in the industry, and I feel like we've been fellow travelers and also participants in different ways with some of the actions that happened. And so the magazine, this feels like an especially appropriate and meaningful event to do, because it's been a big part of what we've written about and what we've covered, and sort of the community we've tried to convene has been around new tech worker activism. Yeah, so I'm excited for us to all talk about it.
I have a quick question before you talk about the mobilization. That is when I read the manifesto, which is really like a confident thing to do, like writing a manifesto always. But you write there that most of tech writing is shallow and pointless, but it's nobody's fault because everybody's doing their job. And are you like the first sort of journalist, academics who start writing from this tech perspective, or from a left-wing perspective on tech, or like a worker's perspective? Are you like
I'm enough of an academic to always be very nervous saying I'm the first at anything. Yeah. I'm sure we weren't the very first. But when we were first starting out, we did feel that there was sort of a real gap in the discourse. We would often say we felt there was this gap between the people we called the sycophants and the scolds. So there's sort of like the breathless tech press that's like, this company made this much money when it IPO'd, or that recounted these founder stories that were like, Chad was trying to get a sandwich one day, and then he thought, aha, what if we could scale this? These like sort of very familiar, if I seem like I'm trying to be funny, I am, probably. Thank you. Yeah, so we felt that there was that kind of tech writing, and then there was another kind of tech writing that I think we felt in some ways equally frustrated by, the scolds, who were the sort of, we thought of them as East Coast establishment media, who are just like, tech, very bad, Facebook friends, different from real friends, this is shallow. And so we felt, there was a vast and underexplored space between or among these two positions, and again, space for people who worked closer to the machine in a way to talk about it. And so when we said, it was a manifesto and we were being pugnacious, so when we said everything was shallow and pointless, that was sort of what we had in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. And I mean, it's also my experience that when we translated your text or your interviews, that we were really among the first ones, also in a German context, to write about like what is like workers' resistance from within in the tech industry. I think like no other magazine does that so far. So yeah, we're looking forward to also bringing more Logic magazines shipped to Europe. We have to work on that one, but that's for later. But Ben, yeah, you start talking a little bit about some of the mobilizations going on, like where can we find different kind of worker actions in the tech environment or tech industry?
Yeah, so first up, can you all hear me pretty well? I just want to reiterate Moira's thanks to everyone who made this event possible and to everyone who came out. This was really exciting for us to be in Berlin speaking at this event for all of you. I think I might start in my very rough schematic overview of some of the tech worker mobilizations. I might start in 2013, where we saw a number of anti-gentrification protests in the San Francisco Bay Area called informally the Google bus protests. Could be louder? A little closer, is this better? All right, I'm gonna put this right up on my nose. All right, I can smell it.
Like he used to be a punk rock singer, bring it back.
Yeah, you don't wanna see that part though. So we had these Google bus protests, which you may have read about, where people were blocking buses carrying tech workers down to the big Silicon Valley campuses. I mention that because I think it has resonances possibly with some of the actions happening in Kreuzberg recently that we've read about from the States against the expansion of Google into the neighborhood. And one way to see the evolution of the tech worker movements in the United States is the protested becoming the protestors, so that workers within the industry actually taking on different types of collective action themselves. So again, I want to sketch a very rough map of who those workers are and what types of actions they've been engaged in. The first thing to say is that I think it's safe to observe that we're, in the United States, in an unprecedented historical moment, where tech workers across a range of roles, a range of companies, and a range of different issues are taking collective action. And this has involved full-time workers, contract workers, workers we might consider white-collar or technical, these are contested terms, so I'm putting them in quotes, blue-collar or service workers. And they've also taken action around very different issues. So just a few of the categories that we've seen over the past few years. The first one to mention is that we've seen thousands of workers who occupy so-called service roles in Silicon Valley. So these could be security guards, bus drivers, food service workers. Seen many of those workers over the past few years organizing for better wages, better working conditions, and a voice on the job, and joining unions. There's a number of unions that have actually been quite successful in organizing service workers in Silicon Valley over the past few years. Now, these service workers are largely, I think almost exclusively, contract workers. So they're not direct employees of Facebook, Google, Cisco, and so on. They do not receive the same benefits, if any benefits. Obviously, their wages are lower, and the conditions of work are far more precarious. But service workers are not the only contract workers at tech companies. It was recently reported by the New York Times that Google, for instance, has more than 100,000 contract workers. So Google employs more contract workers than they do full-time workers. And many of those contract workers are doing what we would consider white collar or even technical work. There was, for instance, a group of workers at Google who were at the center of a mobilization who were contract workers who were writing the answers that the Google Assistant gives you when you speak to your Google Smart Speaker. So there's all of these various types of workers who occupy what we would consider office roles who are in a contract position. And a number of them, too, have been organizing for better wages, working conditions, and benefits over the past couple years. Another category of mobilization to mention, which Ines mentioned around the Pentagon, is the whole category of tech workers organizing around the social harms, the social consequences of the technologies that they're building. So probably the highest profile mobilization was this one around a Pentagon project called Project Maven, which uses machine learning to improve targeting for drone strikes. This was a year-long mobilization by workers within Google to put pressure on management to drop the contract, which they successfully did in summer of 2018. Management agreed not to renew Project Maven, which was a very big victory and involved a very kind of multi-pronged effort, a lot of different initiatives that compose that effort within Google. The interview that appeared first in Jacobin and is translated in Ada is a good resource to look at for exactly how that mobilization took place. But there have been a number of other ones at different companies. Amazon, Microsoft, Salesforce, you've seen actions by workers who are calling on management to stop controversial contracts with a host of government agencies, with Customs and Border Patrol, with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is our extremely cruel deportation agency in the United States. Against local law enforcement, Amazon sells its facial recognition cloud service called Recognition with a K. It's pretty creepy, to various police agencies, so there have been mobilizations against that. One more thing I would mention at Amazon, because it's a pretty remarkable thing, because Amazon is not, as you might imagine, an easy place to organize inside. We've had thousands of Amazon workers who have taken action, signing a letter, and actually doing some actions to try to pressure Bezos to commit the company to shifting away from fossil fuels. I'm sure many of you know that cloud infrastructure is very, very dirty in terms of its use of energy. All those computers in warehouses produce a lot of heat, and to make matters worse, Amazon, Microsoft, a number of the other big cloud companies are partnering with big oil companies to use a host of machine learning services to intensify oil extraction. The last category of action that I wanted to mention are tech workers organizing to demand safe and equitable workplaces, free from all forms of gendered and racialized harassment and oppression. The highest profile incident of this, certainly the one that I think received the most attention, but was also objectively the biggest, which was the Google walkout. I think there may have actually been participation by Google workers in Berlin in this walkout. It involved 20,000 Google workers, both full-time and contract, in some 50 offices around the world. So this is really up there. If you think of this as a work stoppage, which it is, it's a classic labor tactic, it's really one of the biggest global work stoppages we've seen in modern labor history. It's a pretty remarkable event. The proximate trigger for this walkout was the news disclosed by the New York Times that Andy Rubin, one of the creators of Android, had received a $90 million exit package, essentially to hush up credible accusations of sexual harassment that were made against him during his time at Google. The walkout, of course, had a number of other demands, including an end to forced arbitration, and that demand was met. Some of the other demands were not met, but that was probably the single biggest incident of that type of mobilization. The last one I would mention, I'm not sure it deserves its own category yet, although we're hopeful that it will grow, is emerging internationalism in the tech worker movements. In China, which is the subject of our most recent Logic issue, we've seen a mobilization that's known as 996.icu. So 996 refers to working 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. It's very standard in Chinese tech culture. And if you go to 996.icu, you'll see the statement of these tech workers who say, if you work 996, you end up in the ICU. The ICU being the intensive care unit of the hospital. So what these workers have done is they've created that website, but even more importantly, they've created a GitHub repository, 996.icu, where they're having this conversation among one another about working conditions, about what it's like to work in Chinese tech. They're also naming and shaming companies who are particularly exploitative of Chinese tech workers. So it's a really extraordinary mobilization. GitHub is a great place to organize this because GitHub, I'm sure many of you know, very popular code sharing, code storing platform. The Chinese government has a lot of difficulty blocking GitHub wholesale because so many tech companies rely on it. So to get back to the internationalism angle, once this 996 movement was developing, a bunch of Microsoft workers got together, and since Microsoft owns GitHub, they released, also on GitHub, an open letter of solidarity saying we extend our solidarity to these Chinese tech workers, and we call on Microsoft management to resist any pressure from the Chinese government to take down this GitHub repository. And what was cool, if you go to like the issues, click issues or pull requests, on that Microsoft repo, you get to actually see this kind of like cross-cultural communication happening. A bunch of Chinese tech workers coming to the Microsoft repo and saying, thank you so much, this means a lot. Let's talk about our common interest, where the points of contact are. So that's very inspiring. There's a lot more to do there, but I thought I would mention that. So there's a lot more one could say. There's so many actions happening now that it's hard actually for us to keep track. There's another GitHub repo, which you can view at collectiveactions.tech, collectiveactions.tech. This is an attempt to provide a catalog of all the different actions that are happening. It's incomplete, so we welcome your contributions. But if you want to get a sense of just the scale and the scope of the different mobilizations, that's a great resource. I thought I would pull back and in closing just offer a couple of observations about how I think these things are connected. So obviously, collective action is happening on a range of different fronts. There are different issues, there are different types of workers involved, there are different companies, now there are different countries as well. But I think it's very important to understand how they're all connected, that there really is this core connective tissue that links these mobilizations and these different moments. And I think that core issue, if we had to summarize it in a single phrase, would be the issue of worker control. That workers are demanding the power to determine the conditions of their work, how their workplaces are run and organized, and what kind of work they do. It's significant that one of the recurring demands at these different mobilizations within Google, the Pentagon, the Walkout, and others, have been for a worker representative on the company board. I know this is a common practice in many European countries. In the United States, it would represent, I think, a small but significant step towards actually putting worker voice more at the center of the levers of power at these companies. The second observation I would make is that that connective tissue is not just theoretical. It's not just me kind of theorizing it from a distance. That this connective tissue is really being constituted on the ground. That relationships of solidarity are being formed across different companies and across different types of workers, across blue collar and white collar, contract and full-time, technical and non-technical. Significant that the inspiration for a lot of the early mobilizations by white collar tech workers came from their blue collar colleagues, watching them win their unions as food service workers, as security guards, as shuttle bus drivers, was actually a great education in the power of collective action. And I think, again, that communication, education has gone both ways, but that's been a very inspiring example. These workers are also drawing on broader social movements and labor mobilizations happening within the United States. We're starting from a fairly low point in the United States, but in the past few years, we have seen a real uptick in labor militancy. We have a wave of teacher strikes in particular that have been a very inspiring example, and that example has been directly cited, in fact, by many of these tech workers. So there's a lot more to say. We could get more into where I think these mobilizations came from and where they might go next, and that's something that maybe we can explore in the questions, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Yeah, I have some questions before I open up the floor to you all. Is a little bit from the beginning, like when would you say that this, like, I mean, is it a movement already? Because we're calling this event a new tech worker movement. Would you say it's like different places and actions that now summarize to something, or would you say it's a new quality that compared to like industrial workers movement, you know, years ago? Would you say this is like the new, like a new movement from a new industry that is growing so fast? Did this reach like a new point? Would you say that more and more workers become conscious of their power, and this is not just in a few firms, like in some aspects that they start organizing?
Well, I think one common thread, and Moira, you should jump in because we wrote a piece not long ago that I think speaks to this question, is that workers within the tech industry are increasingly thinking of themselves as workers, and that feels a bit different. There's this thing called the California ideology, which many of you may know, which is a term coined in the mid-90s by two British media theorists. And it's an attempt to summarize, I think, what has become very familiar to us, which is a certain type of kind of hippie libertarianism, which characterizes, I think, certainly the top rungs of Silicon Valley and the tech industry. I think what you've seen among the rank and file is certainly not among all of them, but I think there's certainly now a community, a constituency of people within the tech industry who are rejecting that kind of hippie libertarianism and not thinking of themselves as creatives necessarily, as entrepreneurs, but as workers. And when you claim that identity as a worker, it can be a very powerful thing because it brings you into a new kind of relationship with other workers. And obviously one has to be mindful of, you know, one's own positionality, the power imbalances. A software engineer at Google may be a worker and may find power in collective action taking that identity as a worker, but obviously they have a completely different relationship to that company than the food service worker at Google. So one has to be mindful not to erase these differences, but building solidarity across difference can be very powerful. And I think that worker identity feels like a qualitatively new development over the past few years.
Yeah, I would add to that only, I wouldn't want to overstate the importance of the Trump election, but I do think that was a turning point moment for a lot of people who worked in Silicon Valley and, for better or worse, had gone in, sort of bought into an idealistic Silicon Valley rhetoric. I mean, really believing that the best way to change the world was to work at Facebook or Google or build this kind of digital technology. And I think that some of the coverage, I remember the so-called Muslim ban, which Trump was threatening to enact during his campaign, was a major issue. Other issues around policing, surveillance, later deportation, provided a kind of wake-up call, I think, to certain privileged workers who had previously tended to accept this idea that they're sort of even if actually you're a worker at Google, but you're shaping your own destiny, you're a privileged worker, you're an intellectual worker. I think that perceiving that perhaps a software engineer at a company like that might be working on something that they're not politically comfortable with, that in fact, and interestingly, we published a book called Tech Against Trump with a lot of interviews with tech activists, and one moment that multiple people came back to was this moment in December 2016, shortly after the election, when all of the tech CEOs went to Trump Tower to meet with Donald Trump after often speaking out against him during the campaign. I think that the perception that their bosses, for all they seem to be liberal, in fact, we're going to work with the Department of Defense, we're going to work with this administration, the perception that actually maybe it wasn't up to an engineer, how long they should store their data or what should be encrypted, and that might have kinds of political consequences they'd be uncomfortable with. That was a real wake-up moment. And I think a second theme that came up, and Ben, you could confirm this or speak to this, but a second theme that came up again and again in these interviews and conversations was just how grotesque the levels of inequality in San Francisco have become. And it's very interesting to us. Often it was people not right out of school, like people in their later 20s, people who'd been around for a while, who again had really bought into this sort of change the world, improve the world rhetoric, would say things like, you know, that they really believe that, but they'd been working at a startup and the startup got dissolved and all their friends got lost. And the other, I mean, it's crazy. And again, it's important not to forget the privilege that engineers have, but you can be, you know, you can be an engineer or you can be someone working at a startup in San Francisco in what seems like a very good job. And if you have to pay rent in San Francisco and pay for your student debt, God forbid you have any dependents, you actually can feel sort of strapped for money all the time. Then meanwhile, of course, you're aware that homeless people in San Francisco and all sorts of other people have it much worse than you do. So I think those two things, the Trump election and sort of, Ben might remember this, I mean, rent has gone up like 20% in the past year in San Francisco, but sort of the extremity of those conditions both force people to perceive a gap between their rhetoric and reality that for a number of people was actually quite politicizing and led them to perceive this worker identity they might not have perceived before.
So you say that they started countering this Californian ideology, and would you say that through these actions and strikes and mobilizations, do they radicalize themselves in the sense that they also start thinking or becoming aware of the ethical norms that what are we producing actually? Is it for people or for profit? Do you think that they're radicalized in the sense that they also start countering a capitalist logic in a more broader sense? Is that is what's happening?
Yeah, I think it tends to happen in a fairly organic way, right? Which is you're building something and you may not know what it's being used for. You start asking questions, maybe you find out something that makes you feel kind of uncomfortable, and you kind of just follow that logic a little bit further. I think it's interesting to think of these experiences happening in this very kind of organic, very piecemeal way, which is often obviously how politics actually happens. Moira mentioned the gap between rhetoric and reality of Silicon Valley, which I think is a very powerful and a very important point. But often one comes up against that in this very, I don't want to say spontaneous way, but kind of a roundabout way. The discovery that you as a single engineer, even if you're a fairly well-paid engineer, do not have the power to tell Google not to work with the Pentagon, right? That might seem very obvious, and in fact to that worker reflecting on it, it might seem very obvious. But the California ideology, not to ascribe too much power to it, but it masks those types of power relations. The notion that the company is a family, that the CEO is just like you, that he went to Stanford like you, that he could be, because you probably went to Stanford, he could be your friend, that you'll be the next Larry Page. There's a lot of ideology that works to mask that basic reality, that you don't have, depending on where you sit in that place of production, you may in fact enjoy better benefits than those below you, but you don't have meaningful input into how the company functions, into what types of projects it works on. So I think that type of radicalization and politicization happens quite organically over the process of learning firsthand who holds power in the company. Why does the company make certain decisions? I think you do arrive at the fact that it's guided by a capitalist logic, but I think typically one finds that through personal experience after a kind of series of experiences.
And is there a tech worker union now? Because you talked about the service staff unionizing, but is there a union? Or is some people who want to unionize and find a place?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there are a number of service workers on tech campuses, particularly in Silicon Valley, who have unionized. There are discussions, of course, of unionization among the kind of wider tech worker community. Contract workers in particular, the kind of contract workers I had mentioned earlier, who perform all sorts of white-collar roles, would certainly be a good case for maybe the next front of unionization. I think it's an ongoing conversation in the United States. This is colored somewhat by the fact that labor law is quite unfavorable to workers, and this political climate, the Trump administration and his National Labor Relations Board is also quite unfavorable. So I think often we'll think of labor law as a shield, not a sword, as something that one can call upon in a defensive manner in certain situations. But the prospect of pushing it further, I think, might be a little bit in the future.
Okay, and some articles that you wrote and that I also put up on the event, so you can look them up later on, are on a socialist Silicon Valley, like taking workers' control and also taking on the question of private ownership. I think this is always the tipping point of where, you know, mobilization sort of ends, where you see, okay, yeah, we don't have ownership over, like I cannot even imagine like owning Google or Amazon. Like how can we do that? How does a socialist Silicon Valley look like then? How do we confront the actual existing Silicon Valley? And then
that's a big one. Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah, and should we? I mean, a lot of these things, maybe Facebook shouldn't exist, right? I mean, this is the problem with you know, us socialists, that sometimes we're like, oh, we'll just socialize the technology and maybe we should dismantle it. So that piece I wrote about a year ago, and it was really trying to frame the tech reform conversation that actually, since that piece appeared, has grown a lot in the United States. So we're actually having a fairly robust regulatory conversation about tech in the United States for the first time. Certainly since the first time since the 90s, but I think a more serious conversation. What's interesting is a lot of it is inspired by what's happening here. A lot of folks look at EU antitrust, the GDPR, as models for what they're trying to do in the United States. California passed a privacy law recently, which may end up getting preempted, but was drawing inspiration from GDPR. There's now a lot of push by the Democrats in the House to think about antitrust more seriously.
maybe you have to explain GDPR to people.
Yeah,
maybe?
so
Am I the only one?
Probably a few. There are people here who can speak to it more eloquently than I can. GDPR is General Data Protection Regulation, and it's an EU-wide regulation that essentially creates new kinds of digital rights for EU residents, which include things like the right to retrieve the personal information that a particular company or a particular government agency has about you, the right to ask that entity to delete that information, certain requirements about how you have to receive active consent in order to track people. So it's a fairly, I think it's a bit controversial, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who could speak to the controversies a bit better, because it's a very big and a very complex piece of legislation, and it gets worked out at the national level. But it's ambitious, and there are a lot of American policymakers, I think, particularly I'd say on the center left, who see it as a source of inspiration. We now have the Democrats who control the House, and the Judiciary Committee has a subcommittee dedicated to antitrust, which has just announced that they'll be undertaking a number of antitrust investigations into big tech companies. The Justice Department and even the Federal Trade Commission have announced that as well. So there's a lot of energy behind antitrust, but I would argue, and I think I argue in this piece, that there are some real limits to the antitrust framework for thinking about big tech companies. And in particular, the one I think that as socialists we might point out is that the goal of much antitrust thinking is to make markets work better. Typically by breaking up big companies, not always, but typically breaking up big companies into smaller ones. But it's essentially about improving markets rather than shrinking markets. I associate the socialist tradition with shrinking markets, with decommodification, with socialization. I think taking that next step and trying to understand, well, what does that actually mean, is a tough one. And I know there are folks working on this in the platform cooperativist community, experiments with public ownership of municipal broadband. So there are inspiring experiments, but I'm not sure we have an answer quite to the scale of the problem.
The sort of data dividends approach too. I mean, I think there is something, I think for us as socialists, it's intuitive, but I think there is something, as Ben's suggesting, that doesn't quite make sense about thinking of like markets and private data, because data is so inherently social. You know, on the model of the feminist slogan, wages for housework, I often just say wages for Facebook or wages for Tinder. But I think that this doesn't actually quite make sense, right? Because our conversation on Facebook Messenger is not, well, in my view anyway, this is a long theoretical conversation I shouldn't get into here, but I think that it's not, labor isn't the perfect analogy because, and it's also not privately valuable. Our conversation is only valuable in relation to millions of other conversations. Data is sort of inherently, the value of data is inherently social in that sense. And so I think that's the horizon towards which to look, instead of thinking of more efficient markets or what is your personal activity on Facebook. We're thinking of frameworks like the data dividend, which Ben has written about. Other people have talked about treating it as kind of a social good. Seems not just sort of more ideologically correct or something along those lines, but actually more in tune with the nature of what data is and how value emerges from these social networks.
I have a few more questions, but I think like on organizing and the specifics on it, but I think I'm just going to open up the floor to you all and the people in the live stream, and then I just scooch in whenever I can. So yeah, please raise your hands, and do we have someone who... Yeah, sure.
Du musst mir sagen, wohin.
Oh, many, yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. I've been reading Logic for quite a while, so just got the surprise yesterday that you were here. I was like, oh, great. And thanks also for this introduction on what goes on in the US. And I think you should come more often to give this kind of talks, and to also maybe less institutional places, but to also more with social movements that also work in more underground levels on similar lines in Europe. I was quite interested in what you pointed out on the worker identity, and how that I can read in a way as class consciousness that does not belong only to the engineers that are working in the offices, but maybe the service workers. I work with an initiative since 2017 called the Data Workers Union, and it follows up a bit the idea that you pointed at the end of, it's not just the engineers working in the offices or the people working in the kitchen serving food for the workers, but if, for example, all of us here are using Google, Amazon, or any of these companies, and our production of data is also what is building AI services that big tech is building, shouldn't we embrace this form of class consciousness? We have been thinking for a while and organizing assemblies and thinking forms of collective action in Europe, a bit in Latin America, but all the time when the question went to think in embracing the US, it was this, oh no, but that's the enemy, that's the will be at the other side. And I think we have changed a lot since maybe a year ago through the mobilizations on Project Maven, Well Code, all of these initiatives, that we started to see more the potential allies that we have also working within tech. But then maybe it comes to more in this line of what you call this form of socialism. Evgeny Morozov also wrote recently, I think, building up on the same topic. I don't know if you are familiar with the text. But I think from our perspective, what we see missing in all the discourse on regulation or nationalizing or antitrust policy is that we are still thinking in the framework of taking the power out of the private sector and bringing it into a nation state. And that of course will pose a lot of problems for all the other countries that do not own the control on that nation state. Or we can also, excuse me?
I think you need to come to...
Yes, so my question is, how do you see these horizons that you were hinting at the end towards a more internationalist, transnationalist form of organization that is not just owned by the workers working within tech, but that can cut across other sections of society without limiting it to the United States.
Maybe we add one or two more and then you get back to it. Okay, so that was one in the back and one up front here.
Hello. Thank you very much for your talks. I have one question. Could you please tell us if in your interviews or in your research the Snowden revelations that started to happen 6 years ago show up and have played a role in this cracking the rhetoric of Californian ideology?
Second round in the front.
You've been talking about these different workforces. I've been missing one very large workforce, which is connected to the startups, the people, the worker at Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit, who also been mobilizing a lot. And how do you picture them within this whole topic?
Okay, I think we're...
Can I give two short answers
Please.
and leave you with the really hard one? I think Snowden absolutely was an important turning point. I think that empirically or anecdotally didn't come up that much within the conversations for the book we published right after Trump, but there's a professor, Fred Turner at Stanford, who teaches a big digital cultures class, who's done an interview with us, and he always tells this anecdote that I think is really striking. He's taught this big class at Stanford for decades about, the politics of the digital and digital culture. And he said for years and years, the sort of student reviews of his courses, which we do at American universities, I don't know if they do them here, but the sort of consumer reviews of his class said, Professor Turner is so negative, why is he so pessimistic about digital technology? And he says that after 2013, it just turned on a dime, and the next year, and all the years after, people said, he's way too optimistic. It's totally unrealistic to be this optimistic about these technologies. So I think that was a huge, also internationally, I think, in terms of just global awareness of the level of US surveillance, that was a really important turning point, even if it didn't come up in our specific book. As for gig workers, that does seem like another really important category, and I, as the socialist feminist up here, also feel obligated to point out a category that it's really important to recognize is mostly women in the United States anyway. There's been a lot of attention paid to Uber and Lyft drivers, and it's very important. Their recent strike was very important. At the same time, I can't summon the exact figure, but it's 10-fold more women work in healthcare app startups, childcare app startups. So I think that that's a group where it's certainly encouraging to see the kind of media attention and solidaristic actions. I think Uber engineers released a statement in connection with the strike, right? And at the same time, I want to encourage us to think expansively about who those workers are, because the media tends to focus in the United States on just, I think it's 160,000 drivers for those two companies. Don't quote me on that, internet. But there's vastly, vastly more women employed in service work via apps.
And also, I think in the German discourse, it's a lot of people are talking about Fudua, drivers on the bike, which everyone sees publicly, but no one is talking about cleaners for Helpling. That is an app, with cleaners, and of course 80% are women, but you're right, gender relations. And this is, not visible enough, I think, in the debate. So the hard one for you.
Ben's going to say how to fix it internationally.
No, I'm just going to add a lot more problems. To speak to the internationalism, you identified, I think, two distinct but related challenges. One is, how do you possibly democratize these platforms when they're so big, so global, millions or even billions in the case of Facebook users across the world, and have very, I think, safe to say, different national imprints and characteristics. An additional challenge, which I think you identified, is how do you democratize these platforms when there's this vast kind of pool of labor, you could say, that's being provided by users to the platform in addition to the workers who are building the platform. So those users have a real stake in how that platform should operate, and I think should receive some kind of say. I think these are enormously challenging questions. I know that the platform cooperativist folks are thinking at a small scale how to address these challenges, and that we have traditions of participatory design, of co-design, these types of thinking about how to build technologies in a more democratic way. I believe participatory design in particular has its roots in the Scandinavian labor movement, and of trade unions developing agreements with employers about how technology would be introduced into their workplace, and in fact trying to have not just a seat at the table, but the opportunity to influence how those technologies are designed. I think to add an even, I'm just going to add problems instead of give answers, to add another problem to the challenging picture that you sketched is this question of what we could call the Luddite option, right? Which is maybe some of these technologies shouldn't exist. Because I think one persistent flaw in kind of maybe the more, let's say, vulgar forms of socialist thinking about technology is this idea that we simply seize the forces of production, we change the relations around them, and now they're liberatory, right? I mean, this is kind of in a certain sense, this is how the Soviets might have thought of electrification or Taylorism, that we can take this from the capitalist world, put different relations around it, and now it's great. It's not great. I mean, electricity is great, but Taylorism's not great, right? So this is something I struggle with, is like, do we want a socialized Facebook, or is it just too much of a liability? Does it actually, do the social harms outweigh the social benefits? So I don't have good answers to those questions, but they're critical questions, and I hope we'll ask them together. I wanted to add one point to the gig workers. Thank you for bringing that up. That's an extremely important category of mobilization. I think in addition to the strikes we've seen, there are groups like Gig Workers Rising, Rideshare United in the United States that have been mobilizing these workers. We've also seen some interesting glimmers of solidarity, as Moira mentioned, within these companies, between the engineers and the gig workers. And I think that is something that I'm very excited to try to see, is how do we get Amazon engineers teaming up with Amazon warehouse workers, Uber engineers teaming up with Uber drivers. I actually, in preparation for this point, I didn't know you were going to ask that question, but I thought this might come up. An anonymous Uber employee around the time that Gig Workers Rising and others were organizing a rideshare drivers strike in California released this statement, which I thought really gets to this point, which I'll read. As tech workers, we share more in common with the drivers that support the platform than the company executives that spend millions ensuring that rideshare companies and others in the so-called gig economy can continue to bend the law and exploit workers. So again, I think that's a fairly powerful example of how that kind of worker identity is actually pushing certain segment of workers in the other direction, right? The identification no longer goes upwards. You don't see yourself as part of the executive class, but you actually see yourself as a worker just like the gig worker. It's pretty powerful.
Okay, I think you raised your hand, right? Like you in the first round, and then third round. Okay. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to ask a bit more about the idea of the user as a labor force, because I don't know, but in my personal opinion, I don't think it's the same as the workers themselves. The laborers are different because they are also users. And I would wonder, I don't know the answers, but I would wonder when you have from inside the tech industry a desire to socialize these companies more or to give more rights to the workers on the board, how do you think that relates to the rights for the users? And do you think those rights can be unified, or do you think they actually sit in opposition to each other if these workers still want the companies to stay within their same structures of profit?
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I'm a tech worker and I'm European, and we are clearly looking a lot at what's happening in the USA as a potential model. But from here we see two competing narratives about the organizations that are behind this mobilization, let's say. And the major narrative that is what you mostly presented here depicts these workers organizing for single battles and then disbanding somehow and reorganizing if there is a new battle inside the same company. While there's another narrative that I would say I see a lot in organizations like Tech Worker Coalition, where there's more like a long-term project to achieve permanent mobilization and permanent organizations, and clearly Tech Worker Coalition is one of them. And this resembles more like a traditional union than what you have seen like around Project Maven. Like, we won the battle, it's over, we go home. Since you said like you were involved into this, like connected to these people, what is your perception of this reality? Is there something left after the battle to continue the mobilization, or is it too naive, let's say, to like focus on the single issue?
In the same role? Yeah. Maybe you? Yeah. Okay, yep.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Jonathan. I'm also a tech worker. I'm very interested in starting a new chapter of Tech Workers Coalition in Berlin, so talk to me after. My quick question is, I would like to hear more about repression or examples of retaliation from these different campaigns.
We're going to do a third round, so no worries. So maybe? Yep.
I started last time. I think you should start.
All right, I'll start. This question of are users performing labor is an interesting one, and is a contested theoretical question that I think Moira could speak to maybe in her response more specifically. You know, is data labor, is data capital, is data neither? I think it's a really interesting question. I think to speak to your more specific point, how might the interests of the rights of workers be harmonized or at least kind of democratically deliberated, let's say, with the rights and interests of the user? I think these are very interesting, almost kind of parliamentary questions of economic democracy. I would say just anecdotally that without trying to paint too rosy a picture, I think there might be more alignment than we have been led to believe, in the sense that in our interviews, for instance, we did a long anonymous interview with an engineer at one of these big companies, which appeared in an issue of Logic. And one of the things that this engineer said is that we know all of these product decisions that we're making are bad for users. We don't want to make them, but we're essentially being forced to make them against our sense of what would make the product better. So you actually do see these conflicts, and I've seen it myself within companies where you have people who are saying this is a worse user experience. This actually makes the whole thing work worse. And the person who is representing, you know, the profit motive of the company, the business interest of the company, is saying, we need it. It drives engagement. So a classic example of this would be, you know, just some really annoying big notification thing that just like in your face. A lot of engineers or even designers, they don't want that. They know that that's bad for the user, but there's a business case for it because you got to keep people clicking. So I actually think, you know, again, with the right enabling structures, there's some real affinities there that could develop. In terms of how one might do that while remaining a profit-making entity, which I think was another one of your questions, that's a great question. You know, how do we stay within these structures and try to transform them while also, you know, knowing that following this logic to a certain road is going to require an even deeper transformation. I think this question about is it a bunch of single issues or is it a permanent mobilization? I think I want to say both, in the sense that, you know, after a battle, yes, there are things left over. There's an internal organizing infrastructure that remains. There's continuity across struggles, but the kind of concentric circles of who would be drawn into different struggles changes, right? Because in any organizing environment, people will have different sets of interests. You might be able to organize someone for one event and not another. But I think you do see continuity, you do see infrastructure that remains, and I think among the core organizers, let's say the militant minority of tech, you do have a long-term vision for a more worker-owned, worker-run, worker-oriented tech industry, which is also tech in the public interest. So I think there is that very radical horizon, but on the ground, day to day, one has to find the single issue with that concrete demand, like cancel this contract, end forced arbitration, to actually organize people on a daily level. Retaliation. So there have been some well-publicized instances of this at Google. Two of the major walkout organizers, Claire Stapleton and Meredith Whittaker, went public recently with allegations of retaliation from Google management. And just recently, I think yesterday or a couple of days ago, Claire Stapleton actually left Google in response to this retaliation. So retaliation is already happening. I think it's probably happening in all sorts of other ways that are not in the media spotlight as well. But yeah, it's definitely begun.
Yeah, and it's been interesting because I think when we first started following and participating in these actions, early 2017, late 2016, part of the gambit was that certain tech workers sort of had enough privilege, had enough power in their roles that they could sort of use that strategically. And I feel as if, I don't know if Ben feels this way, some of the retaliation has gotten more, it started to feel a bit scarier, like that things are shutting down a little bit. But that said, these relations persist across different actions and mobilizations. On this point of thinking about user activity as work, or what it means to think of it as value creating, maybe it's an obvious point, and I don't mean to belabor it, but I do think, for me, writing my book about dating and capitalism, in fact, and thinking about how we all curate ourselves through swipes in order to make data spreads for the company that owns Tinder, I think it's helpful to remember, even though it's an obvious point, that it's like, what is the source of value at Google? Quite a lot of that is our searches. What is the source of value to Facebook? It's our activity on Facebook. That's where I find, capitalism grows by taking things it can't pay for and won't pay for. And there are older and other examples of this, housework, sexual reproduction, the various topics that feminists have talked about being those that come foremost to my mind. But I think this is this ongoing theoretical debate over whether it's most useful to think about data like, is it a natural resource? Is it an activity? Is it work in the way that housework might be work? Is it both? There's an interesting book by a scholar who I think is in Ireland called Kylie Jarrett called The Digital Housewife that makes this strong argument drawing on Italian socialist feminism that you really can translate the housework is work arguments from the 70s to think about data. I think I don't 100% agree with everything in that book, but I think it's an interesting starting point. There are also new frameworks being put forth. Two scholars named Nick Couldry and Ulysses Mejas have this new framework they call data colonialism, where they say, instead of going back and forth on this question of resources versus work, we need to think about how do you create data relations? How do we create the social relations that encourage each of us or compel each of us to continuously translate sort of social life into streams of data that can be sources of profit? So I feel as if Ben sort of answered the question partly, but to not hide behind the cheeky slogan, wages for Facebook, but actually spell it out. I think these questions about like what is the source of value of a company like Facebook are really live. And to the extent that these worker mobilizations are drawing on this new kind of worker identity, claiming things as work that haven't been thought about as work in the past, maybe are very much in play in the milieu we're talking about.
It's actually funny that we're doing this Facebook live stream at the same time when we're saying actually it's nonsense and we shouldn't use it at all. That's the contradictory position that we as leftists usually have. We do a last round, I would say. There's no questions from the live stream, so I want to encourage you people on live stream, but also I think you, and you? Yeah? Okay, yeah. It's actually more than three. Maybe we do another, this is the second to last round, okay? And then maybe, after the event, you can always also talk to Moira and Ben later
we'll be
on.
hanging out at the table with the magazines.
Okay. So, but do this last round.
Just a quick, let's say, it's two questions in one. But so an element that we haven't spoken about tonight here is automation and the role it's going to play in the way companies are changing, and the way that's probably even making workers futile in the future. So we can, as tech workers, unionize or try to, get enlightened all we want, but if then the companies in a model that's still the capitalistic model will be able to easily bypass whatever kind of voice we would have, isn't that a huge problem that we need probably to tackle with models that are maybe not so trying to, sort of repeat what we've seen already in the past. And the second would be, of all the mobilization that you've been talking about, if you think they already had some really meaningful impact in the way the top people think about the way the company should be structured, even though it's like we should do things in a different way or more secretly, or just not to try to involve the workers too much because it's going to be a problem. One example that comes to mind is Google's search engine in China. Workers with something similar to Project Maven, they were able to sort of stop it, but apparently there's some logs somewhere in some servers that say that some people within the company have been still working on it. So also going dark is another way that companies and people that are probably not willing to unionize within the companies can have as an option to bypass whatever movement.
Hey, thank you for your talk. So my question relates directly to Amazon, because they were doing a lot, obviously, always to push back against their workers from unionizing. They released that really extreme video about signs that people are unionizing and what to do and everything. And then before the HQ2 didn't get to locate in New York, when that victory happened, there was a hearing, and the politicians couldn't confirm whether Amazon workers would enjoy neutrality in that situation. So I'm wondering about how it's like for those workers who are living under those conditions, working under those conditions, to deal with the situation, and what kind of retaliation they're facing when they are trying to unionize, because there's not much talk about that out there. We were making a documentary about it, we tried to talk about it, but we need to go into it more deeply, and then how we as non-tech workers can support people working in tech, because there are absolutely insane conditions, and obviously we're all very much interconnected with that.
I mean, there were hands up. Yeah, okay. Sorry, too many, but you can talk to them afterwards. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I would like to maybe destabilize or ask you to talk more about the basic terms that allow us to have this conversation, such as worker. So I was born and raised in a socialist country. My grandparents were socialists. They were workers in the sense of what Hannah Arendt called the homo laborans. And I'm really interested in the distinction that you made between homo laborans and homo faber. For me, the tech workers in the tech industry are and will always remain homo faber, the ones who labor but have the time to pursue some kind of intellectual, whereas the homo laborans is the one who literally struggles to stay above water. So in this conversation, it seems to me that the two terms are merged together, in which the ones who are participating in the construction of the Uber industry, for example, are benefiting more than the ones who are driving the cars. So I'm interested in hearing how would you problematize this, because I really have a difficulty thinking about a socialist Silicon Valley from this perspective. It almost seems to me like a contradiction in terms, just filling up an old signifier with new content that I do not really understand. Thank you.
I need to think about the Arendt distinction a bit. I think that the term workers, or this term tech worker, I think, and Ben should correct me if he thinks otherwise, but my impression is that it sort of entered a kind of circulation around the Work of Tech Workers Coalition, and they were an early group pushing this, and it was specifically a group co-founded by an engineer and a former cafeteria worker who came to work for the union. And I think that it was, in the way that your comment is getting at, a sort of self-consciously, in a way, strange and polemical term. It's sort of a term that's supposed to help people see something, right? And again, I think it's really important, as Ben was saying, not to erase the differences of privilege among these different kinds of workers. That's absolutely essential. At the same time, I think that that term made it possible to see certain kinds of affinity and solidarity. Just one example that came up sort of early in the actions when I was writing about them and sort of spending a lot of time with TWC in early 2017 were around issues of immigration, which were very much on everyone's mind at the moment after the election of Trump, and brought together, for instance, engineers who might be on these visas we have in the United States called H-1B visas, which make you totally dependent on your employer and very precarious. And for instance, like a South Asian engineer on those visas might actually perceive some commonalities with someone working in the service part of the company who has relatives, you know, from a different background, perhaps Latin American relatives who they're worried about being deported. And this was something people said and that came up in meetings, that they sort of perceived these. And in fact, I remember someone who worked in a cafeteria at one of the campuses saying, you know, I'm worried about these people who work here, who I see every day. So I think, in my view, and I'd be curious what Ben would say to this use of the term worker has always been sort of proleptic and polemical and useful for what it lets people see. And I think, as you're suggesting, it would be completely grotesque to imagine that that someone who, you know, is a top engineer at Facebook is the same as the person who commutes 3 hours each way to serve them frozen yogurt, or I guess probably nobody eats that anymore, kale, or whatever it is they eat, you know, every day. So I think that that's a certain, I mean, you're hitting upon a really key tension. I think the only other thing I would say, and again, I really respect the distinction you're drawing, and I don't want to seem as if I'm rejecting it, but another thing, at least in the United States, is that there's been such a glorification of the supposed, you know, boy geniuses at just a small handful of tech companies. And not everyone who works in technology, you know, went to Stanford and studied CS and makes hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. In fact, last I checked, which was in 2018, so maybe it's outdated, the median salary of someone working in the tech sector in the United States was like $81,000, I think, which again is more than the person serving the kale makes, but is not, you know, you're not fabulously rich living on that by any stretch of the imagination in San Francisco. So I think that it's a complicated question. It's a key question, and one that I don't know a better answer to than that it has to be worked out through praxis, that it's like this term that helps certain things be seen, particularly with the contract workers. I think it will continue to be organizing. Some of those folks at Facebook I know make $15, $20 an hour, $25 an hour maybe, even doing sort of technical seeming work. So again, it's a spectrum, and I think the unity that word makes visible can be useful, even as we do have to remain mindful of the difference you point out.
Yeah, there were a lot of great questions there. I think just to jump in on the one that Moira was responding to, there's a couple of things I would say. I think first is that it's important to know that the tech workers building these technologies are not always or even primarily software engineers, right? We think about the role of content moderation in a platform like Facebook. Content moderators, sure, as you may have read these articles, is an extremely traumatic job. People are seeing beheadings, you know, babies being killed, horrible things that give them PTSD. These are contract workers, sometimes within the United States, sometimes outside, who are not receiving very good wages and working conditions. There is the very tedious, although somewhat less traumatic, labor of tagging images for machine learning, of writing speech for these AI assistants, and so on. So in some cases, many of the people building these technologies are actually suffering from conditions that are as exploitative as the workers being affected by these technologies, in the sense that, you know, Uber drivers are affected by them. So I think that's important, that there are highly exploited workers on both sides of this equation, both building the technology and also kind of having their livelihoods and lives disrupted, to use a favorite word by it. This question of what is a worker is a very difficult and contested question, which runs right throughout the whole history of the socialist tradition. I think I share Moira's feeling that having people throughout tech, rank and filers throughout tech, claim this identity has real strategic value, and we've seen that value demonstrated. I don't think the types of mobilizations that we've seen would have been possible without them claiming that identity. But there's a difficult and complex theoretical point, which I think you're pointing to, which is what is the precise class location of these software engineers, given that software engineer itself is a very complicated category, right? There's a Google software engineer, but most software engineers, of course, don't work at Google. So I think we need more analysis. I think, broadly in the Marxist tradition, we're not always very good about thinking of the middle layers. Like, we're pretty good at thinking about the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, but the problem of the middle classes and the clerical classes and the engineering classes, the classes that Harry Braverman wrote about in his great book, Labor and Monopoly Capital, this is an old and difficult question. But I think claiming the worker identity clearly has immediate strategic value. To speak briefly to another category of workers, there's a question of Amazon warehouse workers. We have a wonderful piece coming out in the next issue of Logic by Sam Adler-Bell about conditions within Amazon warehouses, which, as some of you may have read, are very exploitative and very closely surveilled and controlled. Amazon workers are watched very closely. Their time is measured very precisely. They have wearables, there's cameras, and so on. In terms of one pocket of workers within Amazon who are actually organizing, there's been a really inspiring example in Minnesota of Somali American workers who are organizing actually against Amazon, and Amazon has been quite funny about it and making concessions to these workers on issues of working conditions, but saying that this is part of community relations. So they're very keen not to be given any type of leeway to workers who are organizing. And indeed, I think you mentioned the HQ2 episode. That was certainly at the center of that as well. So there are some, I know there are things happening in Europe as well, but in the United States we have some glimmers of hope on that front. Just a couple last points, because I think we had a question about automation, which is a very big and difficult question, and this question of what impact, if any, are these mobilizations having on the thinking at the top of these companies. Automation is so big I might not be able to speak to it. I should say that automation is doubly complicated in the sense that technologists at these companies are, in many cases, I'd say, building the software and the hardware that are displacing and de-skilling other workers, but they're also building the software that is displacing and de-skilling tech workers. I mean, you've kind of seen waves of automation in the tech industry, and I'd say that's something to watch. For those of you who are familiar with like the system administrator, right, the operator, this is a role that has seen a lot of pressure through the introduction of cloud services and kind of infrastructure automation. So we've seen this in tech, that there's like a category of job that used to be, a pretty big job that is kind of disappearing. So it's certainly on the table, and I think is something that people within tech think about in relation to themselves a fair bit. Just briefly speaking on the impact on the people at the top of these companies. I think Google is an interesting case, right? Google for a long time had this culture of what they would consider kind of openness and transparency, the idea that everyone can see anyone's code, that you can ask questions of executives at weekly meetings. And as you mentioned with Dragonfly, the company is distancing themselves from those principles. I mean, you're now having projects that are going dark, you're having more of a culture of secrecy, and you're having a culture, as we discussed before, of retaliation. It's interesting. I think at first, many people at the top didn't know how to respond, because I think people at the top may have also shared this California ideology, right? It goes in both directions, where it's like, oh, I also think we're a family, even at the top. And these mobilizations, I think, have ruptured that, not just for the workers, but for the owners. And I think we're starting to see a somewhat more hostile tone, which I imagine will intensify.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry it's getting really warm on this stage. I think we need to wrap this up, but you can come to the table, look at the Logic magazines, and talk to Moira and Ben afterwards. Yeah, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for watching the live stream. Thank you, Moira and Ben, for coming here. I've learned a lot. I've been thinking about translating a lot more pieces by you. Yeah, listen to halbzehn.fm, subscribe to it, and also take a look at all the articles we translated for Ada magazine, like the interview with Björn Westerhäuser.
From Latinx? Or
Yeah, from Latinx, yeah. And also like the interview with Kim from Pentagon, the Pentagon mobilization. So Big Data's Hidden Labor we translated also. So there's lots of interesting stuff up there too. And yeah, see you on Saturday, maybe, for the next event on the Post-American Web.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.